Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 2, I'm going to be talking to 8 South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today we chat with journalist, author, and editor Payal Dhar. Payal has published several books for children and young adults, including Satin, A Stitch in Time, Slightly Burnt, Hit for a Six, It Has No Name, and 2 books in the Sands of Time series, The Prophecy and The Key. We discuss retelling and redefining stories, the difficulties of being the chosen one, found family and the dynamics of those relationships, and the physics of world building. You can follow Payal on Instagram at payal.dhar. Hi, Payal. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx.
Thanks, Anjali. Thank you for inviting me here.
So to kind of kick things off, could you tell us a bit about your journey as a writer? How did you get started? Did you always want to be a writer?
Yeah, I think so. I've been writing stories since I was about 7 or so, and I think those would probably be called fan fiction because it mostly consisted of me writing myself into various inadvertent adventures, and completely without any sense of irony that, a brown kid running around with them. And I kind of lived in my own world with books and, making up stories in my head and things like that. So it was pretty natural that I would end up, doing something related to writing. In fact, when I was in the 3rd standard, the first time I ever won a prize in anything was an essay called My Aim in Life. And one of the things, and what I wrote was that I want to be an author. I want to, write books about adventures. So, yeah, I think it was pretty much decided when I was in my preteens that this is what I was going to do. I used to run this magazine called Echo that I bullied my sister and my cousin, helping me bring out. I was like 9 years old and they were like maybe 5 and 6 or something. So I was doing most of the work, painstakingly copying out, using carbon paper to make copies and emotionally blackmailing relatives to pay us like 50 paisa per copy or something like that. And the subscription was like 6 rupees a year. So each of us would get 2 rupees.
That makes me so happy because first to know that you kind of got your start with fan fiction, because who among us has not imagined ourselves in an inadvertent adventure?
I am very happy to hear that I wasn't the only oddball.
Oh, totally. I really was convinced that my path to success was going to boarding school just because I read Malritas and Sinclair's. And I was convinced that I would climb some tree one day and find some far off land. So I'm totally with you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. The Magic Faraway Tree. That was, the imagination in those books was just mind blowing. Whatever issue Enid Blyton had, her imagine, you can't fault her for that.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think her books kind of shaped a huge generation of Indian English readers, Those were the books that I think we all grew up with.
Exactly. There wasn't really anything else. And then there were, the classics. And if you were lucky, there was maybe a library around you and you had maybe a few Nancy Drews and Hardy Boys. That was it. There was really nothing else to read.
Absolutely, yeah. And also, it makes me happy to know that you had that entrepreneurial spirit. 6 rupees is a good deal, I think.
Yeah. I wish that I wasn't so scrupulously fair and I could have easily cheated the cousin and the sister out of some money, kept some more, considering I did all the work.
Yeah, absolutely. You should have been the major shareholder in that.
Absolutely. 50% for me, 50% for the others at the very least.
Well, hindsight.
Yeah. That's why I turned out no good at business.
And you are a journalist now. And do you think that also affects the way you write now?
The journalism writing or the fiction writing or both?
In both cases, you're a storyteller. Do you think that they kind of bounce off each other the way you write?
Fiction definitely bounces off the non-fiction, the journalism that I do, because I love dreaming up technology, and I like the ends to join up. I won't just have a carpet flying. Why does it fly? So that way, yes, definitely. I think that it's very important for things to make sense, even if that sense is a made up sense.
That's good to know. I'll come back to that because I think it ties in with some of my questions about your books. But I also wanted to ask you if there were any particular books or media that really influenced your storytelling, both as a writer and as a reader.
I think that Enid Blyton was a huge influence. And though I say this, there is a kind of a little asterisk and conditions apply here, because it was also very traumatizing in a way for me to read Enid Blyton, because I had a lot of gender confusion as a child, even as an adult. And there's a lot of overt and covert sexism in her books and various other things. I mean, now as an adult, when you go back to the books, you see things that make you cringe. But so, yeah, Enid Blyton was a huge influence. And I think that what I really liked about her was the way she wrote. It's so simple, it's so easy, it's so lucid. There aren't any big words or complicated sentences. And in fact, when I was studying journalism, one of our professors told us that when you write news, you should aim to write like you're writing a famous five book.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it kind of really stuck with me. I think all of us, because I was talking about this with some of my batchmates recently, to actually distill something down and say it in very clear, very few, very simple words. It's a skill. And I really came to admire it in various other writers I read. For example, James Herriot. He has that kind of very easy, kind of flowing kind of language. It really doesn't matter what he's writing, you just want to read because it's so good. I love books so much that, I mean, it was unthinkable that will either be reading it or I will be writing it so that other people can read it, and maybe I will also read it a few years later when I've forgotten what I've written. I tried to write many different things as I was growing up. In my late teens and early 20s, I wrote some school stories. I'm not sure if I tried mysteries. I think I did. But it kind of never felt right to me. It didn't feel like it was me, and it was feeling forced. And it was kind of in my late 20s or so that I was introduced to The Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. And I read the first book and something clicked. This whole idea of world building. I didn't know the term at that point, but this whole world building where you make your world and you make the rules. And it's not just about finding a few fairies hiding behind a bush or, a little brownie opening a door in the trunk of a tree. It's a world that you make of your own with your own laws of physics. I'm not really sure exactly what clicked, but I nailed the first couple of Jordan books, and I started writing something. And that eventually became the first book that got published.
Wow. Because going back to what you said about Enid Blyton and the kind of sexism, misogyny that is overt and covert in her books, I think that is kind of turned on its head a little bit in Jordan, because in the Wheel of Time books, essentially women practitioners had quite a high status, right? Though it is obviously a product of its time, it did turn things around a little bit for me when I read it in high school.
Yeah, I think it did. And it's possible that, that was part of the attraction, because even fantasy and sci-fi, and this is one of the problems I had with fantasy. I'm sure we'll end up talking about this at some point. All these mainstream fantasy stories, they all have a very, I mean, there's this formula, and there's this hero, and then this pretty woman who's the hero's kind of love interest. And women have a very, very specific, a very particular kind of role, either as the princess or the witch and stuff like that. And I think that was the one thing that was really attractive, because Moiraine in the first book, she has so much say, she has so much power. She's the one that's calling the shots. But the thing is that as you go through the series, you also realize that it's still pretty messed up, in the way that the power that the women channel and the power that the men channel, and how the power that the men channel is tainted, and how that's about brute force and stuff like that. And then again, there is this whole mistrust of these Aes Sedai women because they have so much power. I mean, it's still very much a patriarchal world. So Jordan couldn't reimagine patriarchy. Very few people have been able to. And not just patriarchy, every kind of system that we as writers of fantasy tend to recreate and vomit out the same power structures. We are so conditioned that we find it so hard, and very, very few people have actually been able to completely reimagine it or turn it on its head. I made some really good friends in the Wheel of Time fandom. I've never met those people. They are in different parts of the world, but we've known each other for almost 20 years, and they are some of my closest friends right now. But we still laugh at how in some of the books there are these various Aes Sedai ceremonies described where, the women just keep taking their tops off. So we would kind of laugh that, that this is his old man fantasies coming out, which seems something rather mean to say about an author who's now dead, but
Well, I mean, what you said about power structures is so true because, like, consciously or subconsciously, we end up working with what we know. And so much of our world and reality is based around power structures, and that's how our circumstances come to be. I don't blame authors for maybe wanting to subvert that power structure, but what you said about abolishing it entirely is very rare. I actually, off the top of my head, can't think of anybody who's done that.
What I meant is that people try to subvert it, but don't fully manage, like the Wheel of Time didn't. This George R.R. Martin, for instance, what's the opposite of subvert? Reinforce. As disturbing as the books were actually better. I mean, they made it worse in the series. The violence they showed against women, it was unnecessarily ramped up. Daenerys, as a 12-year-old, being raped by that guy. I mean, that wasn't there in the book.
No, and I think also in the haste to kind of make it HBO friendly or whatever, I think they missed several key turns for her in particular because she's actually an extremely strong, interesting character that as she falls into madness, there are so many precursors to that, which we didn't see, right? It felt like such a terrible way to end a series just because they ignored so much of what was actually happening in the books. I think you're absolutely right about the books because they removed a lot of that nuance when they were making the series.
Yeah, the glamour aspect also, I suppose. Even her power, I mean, she's someone who's so powerful, but that power is somehow shown as a mother of dragons. I mean, it's so difficult to imagine women with power if they are not using it for something womanly like, mothering.
That's a really good point. I didn't think of it that way, perhaps because I'm not seeing her as an actual mother of the dragons. But I was thinking, like, oh, she basically spent her entire life being oppressed by some man or the other, whether it's her brother and then her husband, and then she's kind of struck out on her own. And she's kind of battling one with these kind of genetic tendency towards insanity, which seems to run through the family. And also with this world, which is deeply unfriendly to her, even though she's one of the ruling families, and she's kind of an outsider from the beginning, to everything. So I guess I hadn't thought of her role as a mother, but you're right. She is the mother of dragons.
And you're right. There are so many interesting things about her. I mean, everything is stacked against her, her very place in that world. And I mean, if Daenerys had been a man, it would have been, it is enough. Not that I've seen the whole series, but the number of times I've seen the character naked, I mean, why? There is nothing indicating in the book that she kept taking her clothes off and sitting around. I mean, there was a lot done in the series to kind of glamify, titillate, and a lot of it very typical kind of male gaze type of tropes, using a lot of that kind of stuff.
It's so true. And I think what will be more groundbreaking, and I hope we'll see that at some point, is this kind of fantasy series with a more female gaze. The truth is, I think that there are a lot of really great fantasy writers who aren't necessarily being made into HBO shows. And I'm curious to see how that will change over the next couple of years because it does seem like there's more of a market now for fantasy shows than there was before. So I'm hoping instead of seeing the Harry Potter series remade for the 500th time, we'll see more of this.
So I worry that, it might not happen as soon as 2 years because the things that get made into movies and TV series are also things that appeal to a more traditional mindset. So it's very easy to imagine Game of Thrones as a TV series. It's less easy to imagine some of the more, subversive imaginations of fantasy sci-fi. There's actually a lot of really good sci-fi, and of course, that do a pretty good job of this subversion. And I'm sure there's a lot of fantasy. It's just that because a lot of, like you said, that there are really good authors who don't get the limelight. We just don't know about these books.
But I mean, coming back to Jordan, we've digressed a lot. That was a lot of fun to talk about. But I also wanted to ask, what about his storytelling in particular kind of struck a chord with you? And how do you think it influenced your storytelling in terms of your writing and in terms of the kind of stories you told?
I think it was what I said, earlier about world building, that it had never struck me that I could actually imagine my own universe. Not that I hadn't read any other sci-fi fantasy of that kind, it just hadn't seemed like something that I could do. I think there were certain elements in his world building that really kind of caught my attention, that really fascinated me.
I actually would like to invite you to tell us a bit about the prophecy and the book that comes after, which will be out when this episode is, The Key, so that, our listeners know what we're talking about.
So it's a fantasy adventure novel. Some people on Goodreads have marked it as fantasy sci-fi. Some people have marked it as just sci-fi. So I will defer to readers if they want to call it sci-fi. That's okay because it does have a lot of technology in it, at least the later books. So the series is based in a world which is very like our own, but in which time is governed by this artifact called the Sands of Time. So it's about a 12-year-old who finds out that she has certain powers that will make her a defender of time. And basically, she's an ordinary 12-year-old. She's struggling with school and online learning because of lockdown. And there are kids who bully her, usual 12-year-old stuff. And one fine day, she discovers that there is this other world and that she is supposed to play a key role in that world. Her name is Maya. She makes two friends while she's training to be a defender of time. And they stumble upon a sort of a banned prophecy. And like 12-year-olds, they do exactly what they are told not to do. There's danger and there's secrets and there's mystery to be solved as to what this prophecy is and why is it so dangerous. Who's this person who's supposed to have power to destroy the sands of time? And it's a lot more exciting than I'm making it out to be, I promise.
I'd actually like to give you the floor to do a short reading from the second book, which is out soon, The Key.
Okay. So what happens in the prophecy is that one of the things we find out very early is that according to that prophecy, one person will have a lot of power to be able to actually control or defeat the sands of time. And well, lots of excitement happens. The big spoiler of the book is that it turns out that that person is actually Maya. So somewhere in the middle of all the excitement, Maya's parents discover that she's sneaking off every night to train and going to some alternate world and all. And they are appalled, to say the least, like any good parents and particularly Indian parents. They are very upset and they try to stop Maya. But well, obviously they can't, otherwise we'd have no story. The first book ends with Maya having found out this really horrible thing about herself and also this very uneasy atmosphere at home because her family is extremely upset by all the stuff that she's been doing. So book 2, The Key, picks up about 3 months later. Maya picked out the peanuts from her poha, arranging them in a neat curve along the edge of her plate. Next to her, her brother Manan kept himself from collapsing on his geography textbook by propping his head up with both hands. His breakfast lay forgotten next to him. Across the table, Amma was typing on her laptop, a deep frown on her face. She stopped to sip her coffee and take a bite of the muesli now and again. Meanwhile, Appa was pretending to attend an online departmental meeting, his mic on mute and his video off. They are so normal that I feel almost normal myself, thought Maya. And she was going to destroy the illusion in a minute, a second, now. I'm going back, Maya announced, to the Halvad castle. For a moment or two, nothing happened. Time itself might have stopped, like a pause button on reality. In those brief seconds, Maya believed that it would all be okay. Then the edges of reality joined up again and time resumed its march. Her parents exchanged a look, their faces crumpling. Even Manan gave a sharp gasp. Maya watched them all in turn. She wished she could make it easier for them, or at least not be the cause of all the pain. The knowledge, albeit knowledge they only half believed, that the 13-year-old had strange powers that gave her access to an alternate world was not an easy one to carry. Or that everything they took for granted about existence, about the past, present, and future of humankind, or what they thought of reality, was a reflection of what happened in a parallel world. So they had done the only thing they could, tried desperately to pretend that it had all been a bad dream and that everything was now normal. A loud ding ding made them all jump, someone's mobile. Maya, look, began Amma uneasily. Please, Amma, interrupted Maya, I have to go, with your permission or without it. I'd rather go with it. That's it. Maya is also a good Indian girl, taking permission before going off on an adventure.
I mean, at least she asked. At least she didn't disappear in the dead of the night.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was really great. I also just want to dive in and talk about the book. This is a really fun, interesting concept. There's magic, there's adventure, there's prophecy, there's a chosen one, which, if you ask me, are some of the best ingredients for a story. Could you tell us a bit about your inspiration and how you went about creating the story?
The prophecy is actually a rewriting of my first book, A Shadow in Eternity. And there were a lot of things I thought in that book that were unformed. Yeah, okay, fine. Who am I kidding? The book didn't age well. It's one of those things that you go back to and you kind of cringe and you wish that you could fire this out of existence. They've been out of print for a really long time, and at one point the rights had also reverted to me, at least for the first book. So I decided to take the rights back, and I've always been very invested in this world, even after the 3 books came out, which was back in 2009. And I've kept working on it. I've kept writing more stories. I never thought that I was finished with the series. But I also realized that I didn't want it to stay the way I had made it, because as I learned more, not just about writing, but about the world, and as I critiqued my older work more, and I realized how even problematic some of the stuff in the original versions were. When the rights reverted to me, I thought, okay, this is my chance, because it's a chance to wipe the slate clean.
Could you give us some specific examples of what you think you've gotten right this time?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that I've got it right this time. I would only say that I've corrected some things that I now see as mistakes. So, for example, the reason for the existence of these 2 parallel worlds was very kind of wishy-washy. So I've tried to go a little more into that. And in the earlier books, the worlds were called reality and eternity, which is very blah. I've come up with names, Amrozan and Olaman, which are words derived from various syllables from different languages. And even the language, the base language that they use in the alternate world, Olaman, I called it original tongue, which is extremely uninspired. So now it's called proto. And I have a much better sense of how it works. There's a very simple version that you use for everyday speak, and there is a written version and a sign language version. These are very simple versions that you use for everyday communication. But for people like the defenders of Halvar, they can also do very complicated things with it, like layer it. The other thing is that inadvertently, because of, I don't know, I suppose my own ableism, I had made it the world wasn't diverse enough in the earlier version that I created. Everybody was, because these Halvard were people who were training physically, mentally, everybody was super fit, kind of very alert, super soldier. And I realized that they can be super fit, but everyone doesn't have to be muscular and tall and thin and stuff like that. So Maya herself struggles with her weight a little bit. I wouldn't call her fat, but she has decent amount of body image issues, and she actually comes here and she sees that it doesn't matter what size you are. It doesn't really relate to what you can or cannot do. I mean, the shape of your body doesn't really matter. And there are disabled people. One of her roommates, Mingmei, is one of the examples where Maya can see that, okay, just because you're a wheelchair user doesn't mean you can't be a combat specialist. Her overseer, Ariba, she's this really large fat woman and she's a marathoner. There are more diverse genders. This is a place where people from all the worlds come. There has to be more diversity than we can actually imagine.
I really enjoyed that. And I did note that there was a lot of diversity in the book. And it was done in a really lovely way in which they were fully fleshed characters. All these people played a part in the story. They weren't just there to kind of show diversity for the sake of it. And I really appreciated that.
Thank you for that.
I also really appreciated Maya's viewpoint because she doesn't start out as someone who's kind of very knowledgeable to begin with. She's a 12-year-old girl. She grew up in Bangalore in the book, and she's from a kind of typical, I guess, middle class family. She doesn't really have much exposure. She's quite snarky and strong, and she's also kind of getting used to the idea that she's no longer so ordinary. But at the same time, she is opening her mind to a lot of new ideas. And I think you've done that in a really nice way because she's not shown as prejudice free. She definitely has prejudices, but she's open to learning more, which I appreciated. Could you tell us a bit about how you shaped her character? How did you come up with Maya?
When I wrote it the first time, I hadn't really thought about it being a children's, like a young adult book or anything like that. I used to go swimming to this pool that was in a school, and there was this kid. I don't remember her name. And when I started writing Maya, I kind of imagined her. And she must have been about 12 years old. And she would just like to talk to me. And because the pool used to be so crowded that you couldn't really swim very fast. So we would just stand at one corner and chat. And sometimes we would help the younger kids. For some reason, she kind of stayed in my head. That's how I imagined Maya to have looked like. I couldn't describe her. I'm quite face blind, so I don't necessarily recognize people by the faces. So I don't know if you'll notice that I don't usually describe people's faces much. I describe certain things. Like Noah looks bloodless, but his eyes are very bright. Yazid has eyes that are two different shades of browns. I just don't recognize people. In spite of all that, this kid remained in my head and she kind of became Maya. Character wise, my sister once told me that most of my main characters all sound the same. I don't know, maybe some part of Maya is me, though I'm not sure. I mean, I identify much more with Noah, except the skin color and the height. But it was my first time making a character, and I think I might have made her in a little bit in what I remember my teenage years being.
And speaking of Noah, who is the other central character in the book, from the beginning, I get the sense that he's a foil for Maya in a lot of ways. And, he's kind of a sharp contrast to her. And he has a lot of secrets. I feel like where Maya is quite direct, because obviously we're getting her side of the story. We don't know a whole lot about Noah. And as the book goes on, more and more about him comes out and starts like unfolding. So I wanted to ask about the inspiration behind his character as well.
Well, the inspiration behind Noah is actually Spock.
I love that because I kind of got that vibe, and that was going to be one of my questions. But yes, I'm so happy to be right about that.
I mean, Spock has been perhaps the first maybe fantasy character that I fangirled over. I don't know, when I watched it used to come on TV at 11 a.m. every day. I must have been 7, 8 years old. I liked, this whole idea of somebody who's very complex, but doesn't necessarily know or want to express that complexity. Someone who doesn't have that much expression on their face, and someone who can come across as standoffish, but is actually quite caring and empathetic. So these were all things that I kind of saw in Spock. And I now realize the reason I identified so much with Spock was because I'm autistic. And a lot of autistic people do identify with Spock because perhaps inadvertently he's been coded as autistic, like not knowing how to display emotions or, being extremely logical, being fixated on certain things. And so there were a lot of autistic coded things in Spock that as a child, I identified with, even, because there was obviously no scope for being diagnosed. There wasn't any awareness when I was a child, particularly not about autism for girls. So I think that because Noah and Maya are the main characters, I think there's a lot of me in both of them. And particularly Noah, because I kind of built him in Spock's mold, and a lot of the things that I saw in myself also, which is not to say that I want to be an ultra white or 6.5 feet tall man. So I think where Noah comes from is actually very complicated.
But it's nice to know that. I mean, when you said Spock, I think a lot of things clicked for me, because I absolutely saw Spock the same way growing up. Spock didn't understand a lot of the dynamics around him, but at the same time was completely okay with that, like he was very grounded in himself. And I mean, now as an adult, I'm able to articulate why I liked him so much. But at the time, I just really liked him. I love that Noah is kind of based on him. That rings very true to me. And actually, Maya and Noah's relationship is one of my favorite aspects of the book because, it starts out with Maya being very skeptical because this strange man kind of turns up and tells her that they've got to go, and he takes her to this mysterious city. I admit, when I first started reading the book, I was like, oh God, this is serial killer stuff. But it really develops into a very strong bond. And what I liked about it is that it developed gradually. She takes her time to figure out that she does like him and she does care about him. And what happens to him affects her and vice versa. Why is their relationship so central to the story? It has a very strong kind of father daughter vibe. So, why choose to go in that direction for this central relationship?
I think some of it kind of just happened. And the other thing was trying to actually make sense of the fantastic. And I was thinking that I can't put a 12-year-old in a world of grown-ups and expect her to outshine them and be more powerful and be responsible for major decisions that lead her world in a certain direction. I mean, I know that's what happens in books, but it has never rung true to me. So one of the things was that if this is a world of grown-ups, there will definitely be some kind of grown-up or even a committee of grown-ups keeping an eye on her. That's where this whole thing of, okay, wait, but how are these trained? And, this whole concept of each one being trained by one person. That's where this whole idea of being a watcher began. There was actually no other way than for it to be a kind of a parent-child relationship. And because Maya is a child and Noah is a grown-up, and that kind of also complicates matters. It can get a little questioning, a little creepy at some point. So I had to be very, very careful to navigate that.
No, I agree. And I think, especially when you talk about the link, which is actually quite an invasive thing, and which I think then makes the familial relationships in the book so much more important because Maya and Noah are not the only relationship in the book. There is a real sense of found family because this is a different world, but their original world, like the world they grew up in, doesn't cease to exist. They still have families, they still have lives that they are consciously leaving behind to be in this place and serve this higher purpose. Is that aspect of found family kind of important to you as a writer and to the story?
100%. And I'm glad you picked up on it because it would have been a very complicated thing to say if you hadn't. Very, very important. I think the reason that it is important, not just in the world of the book, but even generally, is that I don't know, we as a culture, we give so much importance to families, and the way that families are done over here, it can be great, but it can also be really horrible. Oppressing, abusive, closed, no space, etc., etc. The kinships that develop in different spaces, that idea is really important to me. And also, I didn't want there to be a sense of Maya losing something, that she's lost her family because she's chosen this. She hasn't. She's found another one.
And another character that really interested me was Yazid, who is clearly the underdog. He's been snatched up from this war-torn country. And obviously, this is kind of his only avenue to get away from that kind of misery. And the person who he's supposed to trust the most and who's supposed to have his best interests at heart is abusing and controlling him. And it's kind of a grim storyline. And could you tell us what inspired his character and that character arc?
With both Lev and Yazid, because I didn't have enough knowledge to write about their lives back home, they ended up getting more colorful story arcs than Maya, who's among her biggest drama is how to tell her parents that she's coming back for training. Whereas with Lev and Yazid, death in case of Lev and, wanting a better life for his family in case of Yazid and, of course, being tormented by his watcher. Yeah, part of the reason was that I think that perhaps if I were to write this for the first time now, I would have thought twice about having the Middle Eastern boy coded as the possible antagonist. I mean, in my head, it's really complicated, so I don't really know what to say much about it, except the fact that I did flag it up in the book that because of who Yazid is and where he comes from, and because of who his watcher is and where she comes from, these are two demographics which in both worlds have a lot of negative stereotypes associated with. And Noah tries to explain to Maya why we can't just believe rumors, because we have a tendency to be prejudiced, and because we have a tendency to be prejudiced to certain people even when we don't know that we are prejudiced.
Yeah, I do remember that conversation because I thought it was a very good explanation of how knowingly or unknowingly we carry a lot of prejudices.
Something so difficult to understand. I mean, it's not something that one gets over a single conversation. It's certainly not a 12, 13-year-old. She just thinks that, but why can't you be impartial? And Noah's trying to explain to her that you are impartial, but what are you leaning against? I was like, yeah.
Something that I found quite fascinating is that the antagonists in this book are kind of cult-like. They're this organization who want to destroy or control the sands of time and consequently the world. And there's a kind of element of mystery to the whole thing. We don't know who the bad guys are and what they really want. And throughout the book, there's a sense of like, it could be any of us. Why choose to portray them as this kind of shadowy organization which is lurking in plain sight?
Yeah, some of it was just to create a sense of drama. It's all boiling up to show that just by saying, okay, discussion of XYZ topic is banned, just because you don't talk about it doesn't mean that it stops existing. This is kind of propaganda. Instead of saying, oh, look how fantastic the warriors are, what the High Council in Olaman are doing is that they are saying that no, they are dealt with. You don't get to talk about them. They are over. But you don't talk about them. So, that whole thing about this idea that if you control the knowledge, if you keep like a strong hold on information, that's what's going to keep people safe. That idea is slowly crumbling as the series progresses. And we are finding out that it's actually dangerous to keep knowledge away from people.
I think that's a really interesting way to go about suppressing the information as well. I mean, maybe it's coming from from a good place. Maybe they're trying to be like, we're trying to keep you safe. But what they're actually doing is restricting information. And that's always a classic symptom of a fascist. And all of this whole storyline, it kind of hinges on a prophecy. I'm always interested as to why people use prophecies in their writing because it's a very ambiguous thing. And as we see in these two books, it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. So why go with the prophecy?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about this because this is something else I can go on for another. So the whole point was to subvert the whole idea of a prophecy or what we think of as a prophecy. That a prophecy is some kind of magical prediction that will come true no matter what. That's how we see it in fantasy. But if you actually look at the dictionary meaning of a prophecy, it just means a prediction. And I don't say this in the book, but in my head, I kind of feel that because it's translated from the proto, at some point somebody used the word prophecy and it stuck because of the drama element of it. But what it is actually is just a series of calculations and an explanation of how one can gain control of time, of the sands of time. That's all it is. And it doesn't say that, oh, Maya must be the one to do it, or Lev must be the one to do it, or Yazid must be the one to do it. It just gives you the instructions, it gives you the calculations. And that's what Noah keeps trying to explain to Maya, that it doesn't say what's going to happen. It just says that this is how something can happen. Whether you do it or not is a choice. Prophecies are seen as things that are written in stone. I wanted to use the word prophecy on purpose, and I wanted to make a point that just because it's written doesn't mean you're powerless.
Before we wrap up, I also just wanted to ask you if there are any themes that you think you'd want to explore further in this series, because you've got one more left, right?
That's an interesting question. I think that I will continue to delve on some of the themes of, for instance, friendship and loyalty and found family. And the other thing that I would like to do, space permits, is to somehow work on not making the warriors seem like a caricature, not seem like caricature villains, but to actually have the space to flesh out their ideology a bit more. Because it's not a simple story of good versus evil, it's a story of power. And whoever gets the power basically has the freedom to do things their own way. I'm kind of trying to flesh out the ideology of the warriors a little bit more, and also to find out a little bit more about how things operate in this alternate world of Olaman.
Glad to hear that, because I am interested in knowing more about them, because so far they've kind of been quite shadowy and mysterious. But, there's in the second book, there is a very surprise betrayal. And you find yourself kind of wondering what could make that person turn on their family and friends and do something so shocking. And there has to be more to it than just, cackling supervillain kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's actually pretty scary because the person who did the betraying, her connection to Maya and her friends is a surprisingly close one.
Lastly, I wanted to ask if you have any other new projects on the horizon. What can we look forward to this year and the next?
Yeah, so I'm working on a science fiction novel. It's based on a short story that was published in this Golan's South Asian science fiction, I think in 2018 or 2019. So it's a longish 10,000 word short story. I'm fleshing it out into a book. I mean, not exactly the short story, but based off it. So that's going to be my first attempt to not write for a young adult audience. So it's a sci-fi story and set towards the end of the 21st century, so around 2070s, 2080s. And yeah, so after finishing the third book, that's the most exciting thing I'll be working on.
And The Key is out soon. By the time this episode is out, you'll be able to find it, I think, in bookstores.
Yes, definitely.
That's good to know. And everyone should go out and read it so that, all this makes sense to you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Payal. It was such a pleasure. And I'm so glad I got to discuss these books with you on Arcx.
Thanks, Anjali. It was great fun for me as well. And yeah, and all those questions that you asked me, making me think about my own work in a way that I never thought of before. That's always fun.
Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.